This is House Planning Help episode 225. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and try to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Andrew Goodman from Good Architecture, and we're going to be looking at one of his projects, Haven Cottage. We love this project. It's the UK's first load-bearing straw bale passive house, and also it's got a lovely, crisp, contemporary feel about it too. News on my own project. I'm sure you're aware that we're into the closing stages anyway, in such a way now that we've given in notice on our rental property. Yeah, it's real. We're moving out of here. There is one thing that is still quite critical, and that's connecting the water supply. So we had this weird decision. Do we pay out another month's rent or just take a risk? We'll roll the dice. How are we going to do here? Because a date's in the diary. And remembering this was the water company that couldn't find their own pipes. Right, okay, let's hope you can do it second time round, or else we're in big difficulty. So it's all the little finishing up jobs, putting up the loo roll holders, the mirrors, that's all happening at the moment. Yesterday we had our final air test, and I just loved the fact that when you've got a team that buy into Passivhaus and they have the skills behind them, they can get a great result. 0.33 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. That is fantastic. For a masonry build, it's quite hard to get below that. So very, very happy. And yeah, it's going to feel weird moving into this house. Can anything else come out of the woodwork before we move in? It's amazing how you have just these little challenges. Really, it feels like the landscaping's been done, all of the small jobs. Is there anything else left? We shall see. There's a bit of fencing to do, and then it's over to us to get that garden in order. Let's get to our featured interview. It's with Andrew Goodman from Good Architecture, and I know him quite well because he comes from my hometown of Hertford, and often if we're at an AECB conference or going to the Passivhaus Trust Awards or whatever it might be, we tend to come back together. So I've known about Haven Cottage for some time, however, probably forgotten about it because it must have been in the construction phase or getting towards the end of it the last time I heard. And now I've seen the finished pictures, it's been Passivhaus certified, and we're going to dig through that case study today. Beautiful, crisp design, load-bearing straw bale passive house. I started by asking Andrew to tell me a little bit about his background.
Okay, so I've been working by myself for over 25 years now as an architect, quite a lot of that time as a sole practitioner. Currently I'm working as a sole practitioner. I did have a spell working for a practice in Cambridge on slightly bigger projects before I started my own practice. I've been based in Hertford, and work tends to cover southeast of England up into East Anglia, obviously including Suffolk.
And I often see you on your bicycle because you're a local, and we've often talked that we should get you onto the podcast, and this is just the perfect reason because we're talking about Haven Cottage. So when did you first get an inkling that you'd be involved on this project?
I had a phone call one day from Dave House, and he said he wanted to build a passive house, but he wanted to build it out of using straw bales, and that it also needed to achieve the lifetime home standard, which was current at the time, because it was going to be his and his wife Mabel's retirement home.
Maybe it makes sense to get a little bit of background about him because he was quite involved on this project.
Yes, so he had become interested in straw bale construction and had participated in one of Straw Works' projects. I think building the council housing is at Kesteven, somewhere up in Lincolnshire, and had become convinced that it was just a really good way to build. He was also attracted by the affordability of it.
What was the site like at this stage? Had it been secured?
So, yes, he had just purchased the site. He'd spent several years looking, though, as is often the case with people looking for self-build plots. It had a planning permission for a chalet-style bungalow, which wasn't ever going to lend itself to either straw bale or really to work to the Passivhaus standard. And it was also within the curtilage of a very old listed dwelling with a thatched roof and lime plastered walls. So we kind of tended to use that as our starting point, really, to evolve a different design that was best suited to meet the brief.
So explain about the potential of the plot and then maybe lead on to what was on the brief.
I think one of the key things about the plot was that actually the rear, more private garden space was on the south side of the building, and it was an established orchard of predominantly apple trees as well, Appleton pear trees, and a lovely setting with open fields beyond, right on the edge of the village. Otherwise, trees around the site were going to have some impact on shading the building, but actually probably in a positive way rather than actually a negative way of actually keeping out the sun and the potential for solar gain.
And the brief?
So the brief, as a lifetime home, basically it was still 3 main bedrooms and living accommodation, separate kitchen, dining, living room. And we incorporated the lifetime element really by providing an extra reception room on the ground floor with its own access to a wet room, shower room. So that could be the bedroom if mobility needs in the future meant it was more difficult to perhaps sleep upstairs.
You've alluded to the fact that the lifetime has gone now, but what was it about? What was at the core of it?
I think the Lifetime Home Standard had 12 or 15 categories covering how one could approach a building, particularly in a wheelchair or with restricted mobility, car parking in close proximity, etc. And then move through the building to make sure that one could circulate and move with ease. And if there was more than one floor level, that there was a way, a means to actually move between 2 levels. It could be a simple staircase with stair lift in the future, or it could be future provision of a platform lift with a aperture preformed in the floor as you built it, ready for that eventuality in the future. Other things too could obviously around sanitary provision, bathrooms and WCs and so on, sufficient space, more than you might normally find incorporated in your conventional developer housing. It's been subsumed now into the building regulations, but with perhaps not enough teeth to it.
How did the design develop then? Because you had these elements of the brief, you also had straw bale coming into it. So how did you begin to put this into your designs?
I think a key determinant was just bearing in mind that it had to be built from straw bale. So the idea of keeping the form of the building simple, which is a good approach if you're wanting to achieve the Passivhaus standard as well. It's a good starting point. We also wanted to have full height really over the whole of the first floor rather than the restricted headroom you get with chalet-style bungalows. And we just saw around in the area several Dutch barns with curved roofs and thought that I wonder if that as a vernacular, in the local vernacular, would be a good starting point to make a dwelling from. And that's really how we started.
Was there much of an evolution in that process? Because that is very much what you finished up with.
There were a few iterations leading up to the design that's got built. We did go through a pre-application process with the planners, which was basically positive, a few suggestions and a few modifications on the basis of that. Otherwise, it pretty much, from that point, was what's being built.
How did you deal with the planning permission then? Because you mentioned there was planning permission, so what did it take to get this finalised and agreed?
I think the building we were proposing was pretty much the same floor space as what had been permitted, so that's quite helpful. So it was just a question of whether the form of the building, which was very different, and the finishes were very different, whether that would be considered to be appropriate within close proximity of this listed building. And the consensus was, certainly from the local planning authority, that yes, this was acceptable.
Because it's quite a contemporary building. That's one of the elements that I like. Was it always going that way? Because you can go the other way. We're going to mention Fran in a minute, who you work with from time to time. So, yeah, how did that side of things come into play?
I think during my kind of professional career, I've always tended to approach building in a more historic context in a contemporary way. It's just a way to acknowledge the qualities of the historic building and and not to try and do a poor copy or a pastiche, even worse. I would always aim to try and avoid that. There obviously then is always the discussion, depending from which sort of standpoint you come from within the conservation world, as to what is appropriate in terms of form, what is appropriate in terms of materials and so on.
Fran Bradshaw attempted to build a load-bearing straw bale passive house and just missed out. So has she given any input to this project, or was it coming more from Strawworks?
I had an assistant called Abby Davis working for me at the time, who was doing her Part 2 RBA course at the Centre for Alternative Technology, and she was just convinced that load-bearing straw bale was the best way to use straw bales. And if one uses the wet plaster on the inside as the air barrier, then why should that be any different from using that on a brick block cavity wall? We realised that Fran has this lovely structural timber primary frame, and so the straw bales are not quite perhaps load-bearing in the same way. They are compressed and they are loaded, but not quite as much as we always intended for Haven Cottage. So that might be one reason that the airtightness at Haven Cottage was achieved to the Passivhaus standard.
What was on the outside of the render?
There's also a lime render on the outside.
So it's the same as Fran's from the surfaces on inside and outside?
I think pretty much. She may have used clay internally. I think the plasterer that Dave worked with just was happy and suggested that a lime internal plaster mix would be good.
When we talk about compressed straw, how do you do that to make sure that you're going to hit the air tightness?
There's some standard techniques that involve building your straw bale from, in the first instance, from the ground floor up to the underside of the first floor. And before you start constructing the actual first floor, there's a ring beam or part of a ring beam that gets placed that can be then used to compress using wires that run from the base plate up to the top plate at that point, that then get tightened. There are other techniques involving straps which can be tensioned, and some people apparently just will load up the wall or perhaps build the floor and load up the wall all around the edge with huge bags of sand, anything of great weight. And you'll get a typical compression, I think, of about 50 millimeters for each story height. So once it's compressed, and then you load it up with the next level of construction, your first floor, and then the straw bale walls from first floor up to the underside of the roof.
Are you expecting any degradation of this air tightness layer?
I'm not, no, but it would be wonderful to do some air tightness testing in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, just to see if there is any degradation. I expect that straw bale will always move a little bit more than other materials. All materials can move and crack and could still cause problems from that point of view. We used air tightness tapes to connect the windows to the wet plaster reveals, which is a fairly conventional approach to making that connection. Whether there will be any additional movements around the window frames, it's hard to say. I think anyone who lives in a straw bale house does get quite concerned and anxious about the outer layer of lime render, because if that cracks, that can obviously allow moisture ingress, which can be detrimental to the straw bale itself. Not necessarily in terms of air tightness, but I think if you apply the same perhaps rigor, just looking at your building, seeing how it is, and checking the plaster and the renders and keeping it in good condition, that should help.
Can you just go around the whole building for the air tightness layer? Does it change much to the base and up at the top?
The foundation is an insulated slab system. Then there needs to be a taped connection between that slab and your internal wall finish, which crosses over the base plate detail that you need on any straw bale construction. We did not build in first floor joists into the walls. We used a ledger beam attached to the box beam so that there's a membrane between the ledger beam and the box beam that connects the two plaster layers, ground floor and first floor. And then the roof, which is a curved roof, uses a standard sort of Intello membrane on the underside of the timber structure, which again is then connected to the render at first floor level.
So this building has that Dutch barn feel. How have you created the roof for it?
With the structural engineer, we worked out a system of curved laminated beams that are actually within the overall depth of the roof. The roof has 400 millimetres of warm cell insulation. The laminated beams are only 300 millimetres deep, so we've got a double joist system that minimises thermal bridges, loses the curved laminated beams, perhaps unfortunately, but it keeps the underside of the ceiling simpler, and therefore the membrane, the Intello membrane, just runs in a very, very simple way.
How was this procured then?
Dave basically took the decision that he was going to, and he was in a position where he was able to take 12 months sabbatical from work, unpaid leave, and he managed the construction. There was a sort of specialist substructure or ground worker, did the slab and drains and anything below the ground. He located a couple of carpenters who he worked with throughout the job in a collaborative way, who did any of the timber elements. Strawworks provided teams of people to build the walls in their usual method, providing a training to people who are interested in learning about the skills of straw bale construction. And there was a specialist roofing contractor, so he managed the construction in that respect. I think he did all the airtightness taping himself, and that probably was a good idea. I think he installed most of the MVHR system as well himself.
So quite a practical man.
Yeah, very much so, yeah.
And what were the biggest challenges on this project on site?
I think he had hoped to complete it within 12 months, and he just found that it extended over that time frame. So, yeah, keeping to his original time frame just proved awkward.
And your involvement then, were you just providing the designs? What was the service you were providing?
Whilst it was on site, we just came and checked a few things at key stages and answered queries that had arisen during that time that we perhaps hadn't answered over the phone. Witnessed the initial airtightness test, just to sort of check that things were performing as we'd hoped.
And were there any challenges in terms of getting to Passivhaus?
No, apart from we had designed the building and built our PHPP model using gas-fired boiler for heating. And Dave, partly as cost-saving measure, said, well, what if I don't install the gas main? There's a duct into the building which a gas main could be fitted into in the future should someone want to do that. But fortunately, with the introduction of PHPP 9, the primary energy renewables option enabled it to be certified. Without that, it wouldn't have been certifiable because it's electric-only heating.
So if at this stage it hasn't got a heating system, what is getting that extra bit of heat, or are they just putting on some jumpers in the winter?
Well, the biggest complaint I've had about the building is Mabel hasn't been able to wear her warm woolly jumpers and socks. No, there's a post heater in the MVHR system and 3 other direct heaters, 1 in the hallway and 2 in each of the bathrooms that just provide additional heat.
What is this post heater, just to find out a bit more about that?
I think it's a 2 kilowatt element that is situated in the supply ductwork that's heading off to the rooms where air is being supplied, that just raises the temperature a little bit above whatever it has come through the heat exchanger with.
Does this project have any solar PV or any renewables?
It has solar PV, and that's used primarily to heat a thermal store up to temperature. The thermostat for that is set at 95 degrees centigrade as a secondary top-up immersion heater if that's required. So in the summer, it seems to be providing all hot water. that's needed domestic hot water. The winter, there's a need to use a bit of grid electricity to top it up. But Passivhaus Plus magazine has calculated that the building's actually making a profit on the electricity side. So I guess that's a good thing.
So this project was actually completed a couple of years ago. How do you look back on it now?
I certainly feel that for Dave and Mabel, it's an incredible achievement, really. And it was a pleasure to be able to be part of it. I would love to build more straw bale buildings. I'm not convinced it's a solution to our mass housing needs, but there is definitely a place for it, especially within the self-build world, because of that collaborative nature of the process itself.
Have you learned anything about straw bale building during this?
Well, I knew nothing about straw bale building. So,
did that not concern you?
No, because if there is sufficient information around to understand what is the normal, and from that to work out how to perhaps do something slightly different in order to meet the needs of achieving the Passivhaus standard.
Now, one of the things that scared me off straw bale building was thinking about insurance and finance should anyone be coming to buy the house. So Dave just not worried about that?
I don't think he worried about that. He I think it's not been a problem for him, in his particular situation, it's not been a problem. But I could see that it's not straightforward always to borrow or to insure straw bale buildings.
Well, Andrew, I really appreciated having a look at this case study in detail. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/225. You can review the main information once again, perhaps look at the plans or the finished house. We've got a load of photos, lovely photos too. If you have a comment or you'd like to ask a question, then scroll down to the bottom of the show notes. That's the place for it there. Of course, we'll link you across to good architecture. Once again, houseplanninghelp.com/225. And well done, Andrew. Got a couple of notices to finish up on. First of all, about the hub, we were umming and ahhing about where to go next with our in-depth video case studies because we've wrapped up at Buckinghamshire Passivhaus. Well, we're coming to my own project next, and that's exciting. So that means the first video will go into the hub in the next couple of weeks. I'll keep you updated there. If you haven't heard of the hub, what is it? Well, think of a gym membership. It's one of those things that you can dip in and out of depending on how much you would like to do that. We try to train you, we try to give you ideas just so that you can make the most of your self-build. I think the worst possible thing would be getting to the end and having regrets or saying, if only I'd done it that way, if only I'd known about it. So that's what we're trying to do here via all sorts of different means. We have our videos that we've mentioned. We've also got a number of courses. We have our progress calls, which is a conference call over the internet, sometimes with guests. We've got a couple lined up. We're chatting to Jack Harvey Clark about acoustics in the coming months, also Kath Hassel about water, and we'll line up more and more guests. It means that you can put your own questions to them as well, so that's quite exciting. And then we have the forum, which is the accountability section where you can let us know how you're doing on your project. If there's anything you're struggling with, perhaps we can help, or maybe I can share resources from my network. So if you haven't looked at what the hub has to offer you, houseplanninghelp.com/join. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.